Tonight, we're talking about one of the strangest jobs in history. Imagine this. Someone in your village dies. The family gathers around the body. Candles flicker in the darkness. The room is completely silent. Then, a poor stranger walks inside. He takes a piece of bread, places it on the dead person's chest, and begins eating, because everyone believes the bread has absorbed the dead person's sins, and by eating it, he is literally swallowing another person's sins for money. If that sounds disturbing, that's because it absolutely was. And strangely enough, this was a real profession, a profession that existed for centuries, a job so feared, so hated, and so socially cursed that most people wanted nothing to do with it, yet someone always had to do it. Tonight, we'll explore the bizarre world of history's most unwanted jobs, from men who spent their nights standing waist-deep in human waste, to workers who dug up fresh corpses for cash, to people who made a living carrying away the sins of the dead. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Tell me your country and what time it is there right now. And if you enjoy falling asleep to strange and fascinating history, consider subscribing. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's step into the unsettling world of the jobs nobody wanted. Good evening, my friend. Tonight, I want you to imagine a small village somewhere in medieval Britain. The year doesn't really matter. It could be the 15th century. It could be the 16th. The details change, but the fear remains exactly the same. The sun has disappeared behind rolling hills. Smoke drifts lazily from stone chimneys. Dogs bark somewhere in the distance. The villagers have locked their doors for the night. Darkness is spreading across the countryside, and in a world without electric lights, darkness feels much darker than it does today. Inside one small cottage, however, nobody is sleeping. A man has died. His family surrounds the body in silence. The room smells of candle wax, damp wood, and grief. His wife wipes tears from her face. His children stare at the floor. Nobody speaks louder than a whisper, but they are not only mourning, they are afraid, because death in medieval Europe was rarely viewed as a simple ending. Death was dangerous. Death was mysterious. And according to many people, death could leave behind something far more frightening than a lifeless body. Sin. Now, lots of it. You see, medieval Europeans spent much of their lives thinking about salvation. Every action carried spiritual consequences. Every lie, every insult, every selfish thought could potentially place a burden on the soul. Most people genuinely believed heaven and hell were real destinations waiting just beyond death, and that belief created a terrifying question. What happened if someone died carrying too many sins? The answer was not comforting. Some believed the soul could suffer. Others feared restless spirits.com. Some worried the dead might never find peace. And so, in certain parts of Britain and Wales, families turned to one of history's strangest professions, the sin eater. Now, if you've never heard of a sin eater before, you're not alone. Many modern people discover this profession and immediately assume it must be fictional. It sounds like something invented for a horror movie. Yet, historical records suggest that sin eaters really existed, and their job was exactly as bizarre as the title suggests. A sin eater would arrive after someone's death. Usually, he was poor. Very poor. Poor. The kind of man society avoided. The kind of man children might point at from a distance. The kind of man few people wanted to sit beside. When he entered the house, nobody welcomed him warmly. Nobody celebrated his arrival. But they needed him because his role was simple. He would take a piece of bread. Sometimes bread. Sometimes a small meal. Sometimes food specifically prepared for the ritual. The food would be placed upon the body of the deceased, and according to local belief, the sins of the dead person would somehow pass into the food. Then, the sin eater would consume it, literally eat it. By doing so, he symbolically accepted the spiritual burden that belonged to someone else. Imagine that for a moment, an entire lifetime of mistakes, every regret, every secret, every wrongdoing, transferred into a piece of bread and swallowed by a stranger. It sounds unbelievable. But perhaps the most shocking part wasn't the ritual itself. It was what happened afterward. Because although families paid sin eaters for their service, they rarely respected them. In fact, many communities treated them almost like social outcasts. People wanted their help. They just didn't want their company. The logic was simple. If a man spent years absorbing the sins of countless dead people, what did that make him? To many villagers, the answer was disturbing. They believed the sin eater carried spiritual contamination, a walking collection of human wrongdoing. Someone who had absorbed darkness from dozens, perhaps hundreds, of deceased souls. Whether anyone truly believed this literally varied from place to place. But the stigma remained. Many sin eaters lived lonely lives. Some struggled to find acceptance. Others survived on the edges of society. The same people who hired them often avoided them afterward. And here comes our first shocking fact of the evening. Some historical accounts suggest villagers were sometimes unwilling even to touch a sin eater unless necessary. Think about that. You perform a service people desperately want. You help grieving families during their darkest moments. Yet afterward, they avoid you as though you carry a contagious curse. It is one of history's strangest social contradictions. Needed, paid, and feared all at the same time. Of course, modern historians debate exactly how widespread sin eating actually was. The surviving evidence is limited. Many stories were written long after the events themselves. Some accounts may have been exaggerated. Others may reflect local traditions rather than common practice. But what makes the profession fascinating is not merely whether every detail is perfectly accurate. It is what the existence of such stories reveals about fear, because fear has always shaped human behavior, especially fear of death. And medieval people were not unique in that regard. They simply expressed those fears differently. Today, people purchase life insurance. They write wills. They create funeral plans. They preserve photographs. They leave digital messages. Centuries ago, people performed rituals, prayers, blessings, protective customs, and occasionally, they hired someone to consume symbolic scenes. Different methods, same anxiety. The desire to make peace with mortality. The desire to believe our loved ones are safe after death. The desire to feel that something can still be done when everything seems beyond our control. As the candles flickered inside that medieval cottage, the sin eater represented hope. Strange hope. Uncomfortable hope. But hope nonetheless. And perhaps that's why the profession survived at all. Not because people enjoyed the ritual, not because it made logical sense, but because grief often drives people toward certainty. Any certainty, even unusual certainty. And when facing death, certainty becomes extremely valuable, especially in an age filled with uncertainty. Remember, medieval villagers didn't have modern medicine. They didn't understand germs. They didn't have antibiotics. A healthy person could become desperately ill within days. A minor infection could become fatal. A routine injury could end a life. Death was not an occasional visitor. It was a regular presence. Every family knew it. Every village experienced it. Every generation expected it, which made spiritual protection feel incredibly important. Now, here's another surprising fact. Many medieval Europeans expected to encounter death far more frequently than most people today. Child mortality rates were frighteningly high. Disease outbreaks appeared without warning. Famines sometimes followed poor harvests. Life expectancy statistics look shockingly low from a modern perspective. Of course, averages are influenced heavily by infant mortality. Many adults lived into middle age or beyond, but uncertainty remained constant. Nobody knew who might disappear next. And in such a world, professions connected to death acquired unusual significance. Bell ringers, funeral attendants, executioners, and yes, perhaps even sin eaters. The closer a profession stood to death, the more complicated society's relationship became. People relied upon these workers, yet often viewed them with suspicion. The executioner is another perfect example. Everyone wanted justice. Few wanted to become the man swinging the blade, and many communities treated executioners almost as social outsiders too. History is full of professions that society depended upon while simultaneously looking down upon them. The sin eater may be one of the strangest examples because, unlike other jobs, his work involves something invisible, not physical labor, not construction, not farming, not transportation. His trade dealt entirely with belief, and belief can be surprisingly powerful. After all, human beings often behave according to what they believe to be true, regardless of whether those beliefs can be measured or proven. That has always been part of human history. Religions, superstitions, traditions, legends, rituals. They shape behavior because people assign meaning to them, and meaning changes everything. For a grieving widow sitting beside her husband's body, the sin eater's ritual may have provided comfort, not because she understood exactly how it worked, but because she believed something important had been accomplished. Sometimes comfort comes not from certainty itself, but from action, doing something, anything, rather than feeling helpless. And perhaps that is why this peculiar profession survived long enough to be remembered centuries later, because deep beneath the strange ritual lies a very familiar human emotion, the fear of losing someone, and the desperate hope that they find peace afterward. As the sin eater finished his meal and prepared to leave the cottage, villagers likely watched them disappear into the darkness beyond the village, alone once again, carrying a burden nobody could see, whether real or imagined, spiritual or symbolic, feared or misunderstood. And tomorrow, another family somewhere might call upon him again, because in medieval Europe, there were many jobs people disliked. There were dangerous jobs, dirty jobs, terrifying jobs. But few occupations were stranger than being paid to eat the sins of the dead. And remarkably, this is only the beginning of our journey through history's most unwanted professions. In the next chapter, we'll descend beneath medieval streets into a world so foul, so dangerous, and so unbelievably disgusting that many workers risk their lives every night simply to remove human waste from growing cities. And the shocking truth is, some of them never made it back out. If you think eating the sins of the dead was an unpleasant way to earn a living, then you might want to avoid looking down. Because tonight, we're leaving candlelit cottages behind and descending beneath the streets of medieval Europe into a world so revolting that most people preferred not to think about it at all. Unfortunately for them, somebody had to. Imagine living in a crowded medieval city. Not a clean city. Not a city with underground sewer systems, flushing toilets, garbage trucks, and sanitation departments. Imagine narrow streets packed with people, animals, workshops, market stalls, and homes squeezed tightly together. The smell alone would have been enough to shock a modern visitor. Smoke from fires mixed with animal waste, rotting food, stagnant water, and human waste. Every day produced more filth. Every week produced even more. And eventually, someone had to remove it. This responsibility often fell upon workers known as Gong Farmers. The name sounds almost harmless, perhaps even agricultural. But don't let it fool you. In medieval England, the word gong referred to human waste. A gong farmer was not growing crops. He was removing enormous quantities of human excrement from cesspits located beneath homes and buildings. It was one of the dirtiest jobs imaginable. Most medieval houses did not connect to sewers. Instead, waste collected in pits dug beneath or beside buildings. Over time, these pits filled up, and when they became too full, they needed to be emptied manually. There were no machines, no pumps, no protective suits, just men carrying buckets into pits filled with years of accumulated waste. Now, here comes a shocking fact. Gong farmers usually worked at night because city authorities did not want residents watching the process during daylight. Think about that. The smell was considered so overwhelming and the sight so unpleasant that many cities preferred these workers to operate under cover of darkness while everyone else slept. Gong farmers climbed into pits and hauled bucket after bucket of waste into carts waiting above. Picture the scene. A cold moon hanging over silent rooftops. Lantern light flickering against stone walls. A worker climbing down a wooden ladder into a pit several meters deep. The air growing thicker with every step. The smell becoming nearly unbearable. The floor beneath his boots soft and unstable. Then, hour after hour of filling buckets and passing them upward until the pit was finally empty enough to function again. And as disgusting as that sounds, the greatest danger wasn't the smell, it was the air itself. Modern science tells us that decomposing waste releases dangerous gases, methane, hydrogen, sulfide, other toxic compounds. Medieval workers didn't understand chemistry, but they understood something was wrong. Men occasionally entered cesspits and never came back out. Sometimes they collapsed suddenly, sometimes they suffocated. Sometimes they lost consciousness before anyone could rescue them. One historical account describes workers dying after being overcome by fumes while cleaning cesspit. Imagine surviving disease outbreaks, harsh winters, food shortages, and dangerous roads, only to lose your life because of poisonous gas trapped inside a hole full of human waste. Yet this risk was accepted as part of the profession. Another surprising fact is that Gong farmers were often paid relatively well compared to many other laborers. At first, that sounds strange, but when you think about it, it makes sense. Few people wanted the job. The work was physically exhausting, socially undesirable, dangerous, and disgusting. Higher wages were sometimes necessary simply to convince people to do it. Of course, earning decent money did not necessarily mean earning respect. Just as the sin eater occupied a strange social position, Gong farmers often found themselves associated with the filth they removed. People needed them. Cities depended on them, but admiration was rare. Most residents preferred not to think about where their waste went. Once it disappeared, human beings have always been surprisingly skilled at ignoring uncomfortable realities. We enjoy clean homes, clean streets, and clean water, but often pay little attention to the people responsible for maintaining those conditions. Medieval cities were no different. Everyone benefited from sanitation. Few wanted to participate in it. And sanitation mattered more than most people realized. Without regular waste removal, disease could spread more easily. Water sources could become contaminated. Living conditions could deteriorate rapidly. The unpleasant work performed by Gong farmers helped cities continue functioning despite limited technology. Here's something many people find difficult to imagine. Medieval cities could be surprisingly crowded. Some districts packed residents into tight spaces where waste accumulated quickly. Animals lived close to humans. Food preparation happened nearby. Refuse gathered in streets and yards. Managing sanitation was a constant challenge. Every growing city produced mountains of waste that somebody eventually had to move elsewhere. Where did it all go? That's actually another fascinating part of the story. In many cases, waste removed from cesspits was transported outside city walls. Sometimes it was dumped in designated areas. Sometimes it was used in agriculture. Human waste could be valuable as fertilizer under certain circumstances. What began as a revolting problem occasionally became a useful resource. Medieval people were often more practical than modern stereotypes suggest. If something could serve a purpose, they frequently found one, even waste. Still, practicality didn't make the job pleasant. Imagine spending your nights hauling heavy buckets from deep pits, your clothes permanently stained, your body exhausted, your neighbors aware of exactly how you earned your living. The smell probably followed you everywhere. Even after washing, traces likely remained. It's difficult to picture a profession more likely to ruin a dinner conversation. And yet somebody always accepted the work, because medieval society depended upon countless invisible laborers. Bakers rose before dawn. Blacksmiths endured intense heat. Miners entered dangerous tunnels. Farmers worked through storms and droughts. Gong Farmers climbed into civilization often rests upon jobs nobody dreams of doing. Here's another shocking historical detail. Some cesspits became so large that workers discovered unexpected objects buried inside. Lost jewelry, coins, tools, household possessions accidentally dropped through latrine openings. Occasionally, valuable items vanished into pits and remained hidden for years before someone cleaning the pit stumbled upon them again. Imagine losing a gold ring down a medieval toilet. Would you climb into the pit to retrieve it? Most people wouldn't. Which meant Gong Farmers occasionally encountered accidental treasures while performing their miserable duties. Of course, they encountered far more unpleasant discoveries as well. Dead animals, rotting debris, insects, vermin, every imaginable form of waste accumulated within those pits. The environment was hazardous in ways difficult for modern audiences to fully appreciate. Perhaps the strangest part of all is how normal this seemed to people living at the time. They didn't wake up every morning marveling at the existence of this was simply part of life. Just as modern people rarely spend much time thinking about sewage treatment facilities, medieval residents accepted waste management as a necessary reality. History often feels strange because we focus on differences, but when you look closely, familiar patterns emerge. Cities still require sanitation. Waste still needs removal. Essential workers still perform jobs many others prefer to avoid. Technology changes. Human dependence on these services does not. The Gong farmer may have worked with bouquets instead of machines, but his labor solved a problem every society faces. What do we do with the waste produced by thousands of people living close together? Medieval Europe answered that question with ladders, carts, strong stomachs, and men willing to endure conditions most others could not tolerate. As dawn approached and church bells prepared to ring across the city, a Gong farmer might finally finish a shift. Exhausted, dirty beyond description, perhaps carrying wages that made the ordeal worthwhile, perhaps simply grateful to have survived another night beneath the streets. Most residents would never know his name. Most would never thank him. Many would prefer not to think about him at all. Yet without workers like him, urban life would have become far more dangerous and unpleasant than it already was. And astonishingly, there were professions even more feared. Because in our next chapter, we'll meet men who crept through graveyards under cover of darkness, digging up freshly buried corpses for profit. Their customers were respectable. Their business was illegal. And the shocking demand for dead bodies created one of history's most disturbing underground industries. By now, you might be thinking we've already discovered the worst jobs medieval and early modern Europe had to offer. After all, we've met a man who symbolically consumed the scenes of the dead and workers who spent their nights standing inside pits that most people would refuse to approach. Surely it can become much stranger than that. Unfortunately, history has a habit of surprising us, because tonight we're going to meet people whose job involved digging up freshly buried corpses under the cover of darkness. And remarkably, there were customers eagerly waiting to buy them. Imagine walking through a cemetery late at night. The moon hangs above rows of weathered gravestones. Fog drifts slowly across the ground. The village is asleep. No voices, no footsteps, no lanterns glowing in nearby windows. Everything feels silent, peaceful, respectful. Then, suddenly, a shovel strikes the earth. Once, twice, again and again. Somewhere among the graves, someone is digging. Not a grieving relative, not a priest, not a cemetery caretaker, a grave robber, or as some became known in later centuries, a resurrection man. Now, before you picture Gothic villains twirling their mustaches, it's important to understand why this bizarre profession existed. The answer begins with one of humanity's oldest desires, the desire to understand the human body. Medical knowledge was advancing. Universities were growing. Physicians wanted to learn anatomy more accurately. Surgeons wanted to understand muscles, organs, bones, and diseases. The problem was simple. They needed bodies to study, and there weren't enough legal bodies available. In many places, laws restricted dissection. Religious concerns complicated matters further. Families wanted proper burials for loved ones. Communities viewed graves as sacred places deserving protection. Yet medical schools desperately needed cadavers for education. Whenever demand exceeds supply, history teaches us something predictable. Someone finds a way to profit, and that's exactly what happened. Suddenly, freshly buried corpses became valuable commodities. Not valuable to grieving families, of course. Valuable to anatomy schools. Valuable to instructors. Valuable to students eager to learn. And valuable enough that some criminals began viewing cemeteries as business opportunities. Now, here's a shocking fact. In certain periods, a recently buried adult body could be worth more money than many laborers earned in weeks of honest work. Think about that. A corpse lying beneath the soil represented income for desperate men struggling to survive. Temptation could become difficult to resist, especially during harsh economic times. The work itself required a strange combination of patience, stealth, and nerve. Resurrection men typically preferred newly buried graves. Fresh soil was easier to dig through. Older graves required more effort and increased the risk of discovery. A freshly dug grave also meant the body would still be useful for anatomical study. Contrary to popular imagination, many grave robbers weren't interested in stealing jewelry or clothing. In fact, they often left those items behind. Why? Because stealing property was treated differently under the law than removing a corpse. It sounds absurd today, but legally speaking, the body itself occupied a peculiar position. In some regions, a corpse was not considered personal property in the same way as valuable possessions buried alongside it. As a result, grave robbers sometimes stripped away the body while carefully leaving watches, rings, and clothing untouched. Imagine being a grieving family member discovering that situation. The grave appears disturbed, the coffin damaged, personal belongings still present. Yet, the body itself is gone. It's difficult to imagine a more horrifying discovery. Not surprisingly, communities became furious. Fear spread quickly. Families worried about recently buried loved ones. Rumors circulated through villages and cities. People whispered about mysterious figures moving through cemeteries after dark. Parents warned children. Church authorities condemned the practice. Newspapers occasionally published alarming stories. And suddenly being buried wasn't always enough to guarantee remaining buried. Some families fought back. One of the most fascinating examples involved something called a morte was essentially a protective iron cage placed over a grave. Yes, an actual cage built specifically to stop grave robbers. Picture that for a moment, your loved one passes away. The funeral concludes. The burial takes place. Then, workers install a heavy iron structure over the grave to prevent someone from stealing the body. If that sounds extreme, remember how serious the threat had become. Entire industries developed around protecting the dead, and mortsafes weren't the only solution. Some cemeteries hired guards, others built watch houses overlooking burial grounds. Certain communities organized night patrols. Friends and relatives occasionally took turns, watching fresh graves 4 weeks after burial. Imagine spending cold nights guarding a cemetery simply because someone might try to steal a corpse. Yet, people genuinely did it because the fear was real and sometimes justified. Here's another disturbing fact. Professional grave robbers often worked surprisingly efficiently. Experienced teams could uncover a coffin, open it, remove the body, refill the grave, and disappear before dawn. Speed mattered. The longer they remained in the cemetery, the greater the risk of being caught. Many developed techniques specifically designed to minimize noise and reduce visible damage. Some approach their work with the efficiency of skilled tradesmen, which somehow makes the entire story even stranger. Because we're not talking about random acts of vandalism, we're talking about organized operations driven by supply and demand, a dark marketplace hidden beneath respectable society. And perhaps that's the most unsettling aspect of all. The customers weren't criminals lurking in alleys. Many were respected institutions, medical schools, educational organizations, students, future doctors, people pursuing scientific knowledge. In other words, both sides believed they had reasons for participating. The grave robbers wanted money. The medical community wanted bodies for study. The families wanted peace for their loved ones. Everyone's goals collided, and nobody found an easy solution. Now, from a modern perspective, it's easy to sympathize with grieving families. Most people understandably recoil at the thought of graves being disturbed, yet it's also worth remembering that anatomical study contributed enormously to medical progress. Doctors learned more about disease. Surgeons improved techniques. Medical education became increasingly accurate. Knowledge expanded. The problem wasn't the desire to learn. The problem was how bodies were obtained. History is filled with situations where good intentions collide with ethical dilemmas. This was certainly one of them, and some individuals became infamous because of it. Though we'll avoid dwelling on the darkest examples tonight, certain criminals moved beyond grave robbing into crimes far more horrifying. Public out eventually grew so intense that governments began reforming laws surrounding anatomical study. The hope was simple: provide legal access to cadavers, reduce incentives for body theft, protect cemeteries, support medical education. Not a perfect solution, but better than allowing criminal networks to supply anatomy schools. Over time, regulations changed. The demand for grave robbers declined, and one of history's strangest professions slowly faded away. Yet, for generations, families continued living with a fear that sounds almost unbelievable today. Not fear of ghosts, not fear of vampires, not fear of monsters. Fear that someone might steal the body itself. And perhaps that's why this chapter remains so fascinating. It reveals how quickly ordinary assumptions can disappear. Most of us take certain expectations for granted. We assume hospitals have legal training materials. We assume cemeteries are secure. We assume loved ones can rest undisturbed after burial. But history reminds us that these assumptions developed gradually. They weren't always guaranteed. At one point, preserving a grave required guards, iron cages, and sleepless nights. At one point, corpses possessed market value. At one point, stealing the dead became someone's profession. And astonishingly, we've still not reached the most feared occupations on our list, because in the next chapter, we'll meet individuals whose daily work brought them face with one of humanity's oldest enemies, disease. They entered places others avoided, cared for people society often abandoned, and accepted risks that could cost them everything. And the shocking truth is that many of them knew exactly how dangerous the job was, yet chose to do it anyway. As frightening as grave robbers may seem, at least most of them worried about getting caught, the people we re-meeting tonight faced something far more dangerous, something invisible, something that couldn't be outrun, negotiated with, or fought using a sword. Disease, and in a world before antibiotics, vaccines, and modern hospitals, disease was often one of the most terrifying forces imaginable. Yet, someone still had to care for the sick. Imagine hearing rumors spreading through your town. A strange illness has appeared nearby. A traveler arrived coughing. Several people have become feverish. One family has locked themselves inside their home. Another has already lost a relative. Nobody understands exactly what is happening. Nobody knows how the disease spreads. Nobody knows who might become infected next. Fear grows rapidly because uncertainty is often more frightening than certainty. Most people reacted exactly as you would expect. They stayed away. They avoided contact. They protected their families. They prayed. They hoped the sickness would pass them by. But while everyone else tried to keep their distance, a small group of workers moved in the opposite direction. They approached the sick instead of avoiding them. They entered infected homes. They cleaned bedding. They carried food. They comforted dying patients. They handled situations that terrified nearly everyone else. One group frequently associated with this dangerous work were caretakers in hospitals and leper houses. Now, when modern people hear the word hospital, they often imagine advanced equipment, trained specialists, bright lighting, and sterile conditions. Medieval hospitals were very different. Many functioned more like charitable shelters than medical centers. They offered food, beds, religious care, and basic assistance. Treatment options remained limited because medical knowledge itself remained limited. Yet despite those limitations, these institutions served an important purpose. Somebody needed to care for people who could not care for themselves. The elderly, the disabled, the poor, the chronically ill, the abandoned. Society often depended upon caregivers whose names rarely appeared in history books. Now here's a shocking fact. Many medieval caretakers had little understanding of how diseases actually spread, yet they constantly exposed themselves to infection. Imagine entering room after room filled with coughing patients while having no concept of bacteria or viruses. Today, we instinctively think about hand sanitizer, masks, sterilization, and contamination. They had none of that knowledge. They faced danger they couldn't even fully see. Leprosy, in particular, generated enormous fear throughout medieval Europe. The disease could cause visible physical changes, which made it especially frightening to observers. Communities often viewed sufferers with a mixture of sympathy, fear, misunderstanding, and superstition. In some places, leper houses were established outside city walls to separate patients from larger populations. Picture one of these caretakers beginning a typical day. Dawn breaks over a small hospital on the edge of town. The building is cold. The beds are simple. Supplies are limited. Several patients need assistance standing. Others require food. Some need wounds cleaned and bandages changed. Others simply need companionship because loneliness can be every bit as painful as illness. The work never truly ends. There are meals to prepare, rooms to clean, patients to comfort, linen to wash, fires to maintain, problems to solve. And unlike many professions, success often feels invisible. People notice failures. They notice suffering. They notice death. But countless acts of care occur quietly, without recognition. Here's something surprising. Many caretakers were motivated by religious belief. Helping the sick was often viewed as a spiritual duty. Acts of charity carried deep significance. Caring for vulnerable people reflected values that many communities considered sacred. In other words, these workers weren't always motivated primarily by money. Sometimes they believed the work itself possessed moral importance. Of course, good intentions didn't eliminate risk. Disease outbreaks could transform hospitals into terrifying places. Beds filled rapidly. Resources became strained. Caregivers worked longer hours. Anxiety spread through entire communities. Every cough attracted attention. Every fever raised concern. Every new patient increased uncertainty. And then there were plague outbreaks. Even centuries later, the word plague still captures the imagination. Images of black clothing, deserted streets, and mass graves immediately come to mind. Reality was often chaotic and frightening. Entire towns struggled to understand what was happening around them. Rumors circulated. Explanations varied. Fear spread almost as quickly as disease itself. During such crises, caretakers occupied an extraordinary position. While others fled, many remained. While others isolated themselves, many continued serving vulnerable populations. While others worried about survival, caretakers often focused on helping those already suffering. Now, here's another shocking fact. Some caregivers likely understood they faced a higher chance of becoming sick themselves. They may not have understood germs, but they could observe patterns. They noticed that people caring for the ill sometimes became ill. They saw connections. They recognized danger. Yet many continued their work anyway. That doesn't mean they were fearless. History rarely rewards us with perfect heroes immune to fear. Most people experience fear. Courage simply means acting despite it. A caretaker entering an infected room may have felt exactly the same anxiety that anyone else would feel. The difference was that they entered anyway. Imagine carrying food to someone everyone else avoids. Imagine sitting beside a patient nobody wants to touch. Imagine hearing stories of illness spreading across neighboring towns while continuing to work among vulnerable populations every day. That's not merely physical labor. That's emotional labor as well. And emotional exhaustion can be surprisingly heavy. Many historical records focused on kings, wars, and political events. Yet countless ordinary workers quietly supported society through difficult times. Caregivers belong firmly within that category. Their contributions rarely produced dramatic headlines. They rarely commanded armies or ruled nations. Yet communities depended upon them nonetheless. One fascinating detail involves how isolated many patients became. Severe illness could separate people from normal social life. Friends visited less often. Neighbors kept their distance. Fear influenced behavior. In such circumstances, caregivers sometimes became patients' primary human contact. They offered conversation, reassurance, and companionship in addition to practical assistance. Think about how important that must have been. Human beings are social creatures. We crave connection. We want reassurance when frightened. We want comfort when suffering. We want someone nearby when facing uncertainty. Medieval caregivers often provided exactly those things. Of course, not every institution operated perfectly. Resources varied enormously. Conditions differed from place to place. Some facilities offered relatively decent care by contemporary standards. Others struggled significantly. Poverty affected outcomes. Local leadership mattered. Available funding mattered. Geography mattered. Like most historical subjects, reality was complex. Yet one fact remains remarkably consistent. Somebody had to do the work. Somebody had to change bedding. Somebody had to prepare meals. Somebody had to clean wounds. Somebody had to comfort frightened patients. Somebody had to remain when everyone else wanted to leave. And because these responsibilities involved disease, suffering, and death, they were not jobs most people eagerly pursued. Perhaps that's what makes this profession so compelling. Unlike grave robbers seeking profit or sanitation workers battling filth, caregivers confronted human vulnerability directly. Every day reminded them how fragile life could be. Every patient represented a story. Every recovery brought hope. Every loss brought grief. It's difficult work even today. Imagine how much harder it must have been centuries ago as evening settled over the hospital and candles illuminated stone walls. A caretaker might finally sit down after hours of labor, exhausted, worried about tomorrow, concerned for patients, aware of risks, yet preparing to do it all again at sunrise. Most people would never remember their names. History often forgets individuals like these, but their work mattered. Their sacrifices mattered. And their courage mattered. Because while disease frightened entire populations, someone still had to walk through the door and offer help. And in our next chapter, we'll meet another profession few people envied. The rat catchers, men who spent their days hunting some of the most hated creatures in history, often in filthy alleys, crowded markets, and disease-ridden neighborhoods. The shocking part is not how many rats they found, it's how many they couldn't catch. If you were walking through a medieval city after sunset, there was one sound you might hear almost everywhere. Not church bells, not horses, not merchants closing their shops for the night. A scratching sound, tiny claws moving behind walls, rustling beneath floorboards, the unmistakable sound of rats. Today, most people dislike rats. Medieval people absolutely despised them. They appeared in homes, warehouses, bakeries, markets, stables, docks, and sewers. They stole food, contaminated supplies, frightened families, and seemed capable of squeezing through impossibly small openings. No matter how many were killed, more always appeared. It must have felt as if the city itself was producing them. Now, imagine having a job that required chasing these creatures every single day. While everyone else avoided them, you actively searched for them. While families screamed at the sight of a rat, you followed it into dark corners. While merchants worried about losing their inventory, you became their last line of defense. This was the life of the rat catcher, one of history's strangest and least glamorous professions. A typical morning might begin with complaints from local shopkeepers. A baker discovers chewed sacks of grain. A warehouse owner notices damaged supplies. A tavern keeper finds droppings beneath storage shelves. Someone always has a rat problem. And when enough frustration accumulates, they call for a professional. Here's a shocking fact. In some cities, rat populations were so large that people could kill dozens in a single building and still see no noticeable difference. A few weeks later, imagine fighting an enemy that constantly replaced its losses. It must have felt hopeless. Yet, rat catchers kept trying because communities desperately needed them. The tools varied: traps, nets, clubs, ferrets, dogs. Whatever increased the odds of success. Some rat catchers became remarkably skilled at understanding rodent behavior. They learned where rats nested, where they searched for food, and which routes they preferred. In many ways, the profession required patience more than strength. A careless hunter often caught nothing. An observant one could identify patterns invisible to everyone else. Picture a crowded marketplace at dawn. Vendors unload carts filled with vegetables, grain, meat, and bread. Customers begin arriving. Business appears normal. Yet beneath wooden stalls and behind stacked barrels, rats are already moving. They know exactly where food is stored. They know where scraps will fall. They know how to survive among humans remarkably well. Perhaps that's why rats have accompanied civilization for thousands of years. Wherever humans gather, opportunities appear. Food becomes available. Shelter exists. Waste accumulates. Rats exploit every advantage. In a strange way, their success mirrors our own adaptability. Of course, medieval people weren't interested in admiring rats. They wanted them gone, and they had good reasons. Now comes one of the most famous and frightening facts in history. Rats are often associated with the Black Death, the devastating plague pandemic that killed millions across Europe. Modern historians continued debating the precise mechanisms behind the disease's spread, and the story is more complicated than many people realize. But in the popular imagination, rats became symbols of plague, fear, and death itself. Imagine living in a community where disease outbreaks periodically devastated entire neighborhoods. Then imagine seeing rats everywhere. Whether or not people fully understood the scientific connections, fear naturally attached itself to the animals. Rats became associated with misfortune. They represented contamination, danger, and uncertainty. For rat catchers, this meant their profession involved more than pest control. They were battling creatures many people viewed with genuine dread. Every captured rat offered a small sense of relief. Every infestation eliminated felt like a victory. But victory was rarely permanent. Another shocking fact is that some professional rat catchers intentionally kept live rats. Yes, really, in certain periods, captured rats could be used for breeding dogs, training hunting animals, or even public rat baiting spectacles, where dogs competed against large numbers of rodents. Strange as it sounds today, entertainment standards were very different in the past. History often reminds us that people from earlier centuries entertained themselves in ways modern audiences find bewildering. Activities considered normal then might seem shocking now. Rat baiting was one example. Crowds gathered, bets were placed, animals were released, and rat catchers sometimes supplied the participants. This created an unusual contradiction. Society wanted rats eliminated, yet some industries benefited from having access to them. Human beings have always possessed a talent for turning almost anything into business. The work itself could be physically unpleasant. Rat catchers crawled through storage rooms, cellars, barns, attics, and narrow spaces most people avoided. Dirt, dust, insects, and foul odors were common companions. Long before modern protective equipment existed, workers exposed themselves to bites, scratches, and unsanitary conditions. Imagine reaching into a dark hole where dozens of frightened rats might be hiding. You can't see clearly. You don't know exactly what's inside. Suddenly, something moves. Something bites. Something tries to escape. And tomorrow, you'll have to do it all again. Not exactly the dream career most children imagine. Yet, successful rat catchers sometimes developed impressive reputations. Communities valued results. If one worker consistently solved infestations while others failed, word spread quickly. Reputation could mean more customers, better income, and greater opportunities. One famous example from later history was a Victorian rat catcher named Jack Black, who became something of a celebrity. He supplied unusual colored rats as pets and cultivated a public image that attracted attention. Even a profession as unglamorous as rat catching occasionally produced larger-than-life personalities. Still, most workers experienced a much harsher reality. Long hours, dirty conditions, constant complaints, endless infestations. Success measured by how effectively they removed creatures everyone hated. And perhaps that's what makes this profession fascinating. Rat catchers fought a battle they could never completely win. Cities continued growing. Food continued arriving. Rats continued reproducing. No matter how skilled the hunter, the enemy remained stubbornly persistent. In some ways, their struggle reflected a larger truth about history itself. Many essential jobs don't solve problems permanently. They manage them. Farmers keep producing food because people keep eating. Builders keep repairing structures because structures deteriorate. Sanitation workers keep cleaning because waste continues accumulating. Rat catchers kept hunting because rats kept returning. The work mattered precisely because the challenge never disappeared. As evening approached and market stalls closed for the day, a rat catcher might carry home a sack filled with evidence of another successful shift. Tired muscles, dirty clothes, a few coins earned honestly, perhaps satisfaction at helping local businesses protect their supplies. Most townspeople would sleep comfortably without thinking much about the rats hidden beyond sight or the men hunting them. But hidden beneath every thriving city was a constant battle against pests, contamination, and decay. Rat catchers stood on the front lines of that battle, armed with little more than patience, experience, and determination. And astonishingly, some jobs were considered even worse because, in our next chapter, we'll meet workers whose responsibilities involved carrying terrible news through villages and towns. News nobody wanted to hear. News that could change lives in a single moment. And the shocking truth is that sometimes the messenger became almost as feared as the message itself. Imagine sitting quietly inside your home on a cold medieval evening. The fire crackles softly. Your family gathers nearby. Outside, the village seems peaceful. Then suddenly, a bell echoes through the darkness. Once, twice, 3 times. Everyone recognizes the sound immediately. It isn't announcing a festival. It isn't celebrating a wedding. It means someone has died long before newspapers, telephones, or social media existed. Entire communities often learned about death through the ringing of bells, and the people responsible for delivering that message carried one of the most unsettling jobs in history. The death bell ringer occupied a strange position within society. Villagers depended on him for information, yet his appearance rarely brought good news. Whenever he walked through the streets, carrying his bell, people instinctively paid attention. Parents paused conversations. Merchants glanced up from their work. Children grew quiet. The sound itself created anxiety because everyone understood what it usually meant. In some places, different bell patterns could even indicate whether the deceased was a man, woman, or child. Imagine hearing those familiar tones and immediately wondering if someone you loved might be gone. Here's a shocking fact. During major disease outbreaks, death bells sometimes rang so frequently that they became part of the background noise of daily life. Entire communities could spend weeks hearing bell after bell announcing new deaths. Some accounts describe people becoming emotionally exhausted from the constant reminders. Yet the bell ringers continued their duties regardless of whether fear or personal grief. In many cases, they personally knew the people whose deaths they announced. One day, they might exchange greetings in the marketplace. The next day, they would be ringing a bell in their memory. The work could also be surprisingly dangerous. Bell ringers often traveled at night, walked through isolated areas, and entered communities experiencing outbreaks of disease. During times of plague or epidemic, they risked exposure simply by performing their responsibilities, yet somebody had to spread information. Somebody had to notify the church. Somebody had to help organize funerals and community responses. In an age without instant communication, a single individual carrying a bell could become the most important source of news for an entire village. As darkness settled over medieval Europe, a bell ringer might begin another lonely journey through narrow streets, illuminated only by moonlight and lantern glow. With every ring, families looked toward their doors, silently hoping the news concerned someone else. It was a profession built around humanity's oldest certainty. Sooner or later, every community must confront death. And in our next chapter, we'll meet workers whose profession forced them to stand even closer to mortality itself. Men responsible for carrying out justice on behalf of kings, courts, and governments. Men whose names inspired fear long before they ever arrived. If there was one profession capable of making an entire crowd fall silent, it was the executioner. Long before he appeared in the town square, rumors would spread through streets and marketplaces. People whispered about upcoming punishments. Children were warned to stay close to their parents. Merchants paused their work. And somewhere nearby, a man prepared for a task almost nobody else wanted. Contrary to popular imagination, executioners were not always cruel men who enjoyed violence. In many cases, they were simply workers performing a legal duty assigned by authorities. Yet society often treated them with suspicion, fear, and even disgust. Now, here's a shocking fact. In many parts of medieval Europe, executioners were considered social outcasts despite being government employees. They carried out official orders, but many ordinary citizens refused to associate with them. Some struggled to find spouses. Others were excluded from community activities. People wanted justice to be enforced, yet they often avoided the very individuals responsible for enforcing it. The contradiction was remarkable. The executioner served the law, but frequently lived on the margins of society. The job itself required far more skill than many people realize. A clean execution was considered important because a mistake could create chaos, suffering, and public outrage. Imagine standing before hundreds of spectators, knowing every eye is watching your next movement. A single error could become the talk of the region for years. Historical records contain accounts of botched executions that horrified crowds and damaged the executioner's reputation. In some cases, an executioner spent years learning techniques and maintaining equipment because failure carried enormous consequences. But the profession involved much more than executions alone. Many executioners handled other unpleasant responsibilities nobody else wanted. They disposed of animal carcasses, removed dead animals from public spaces, supervised certain punishments, and sometimes performed tasks connected to public sanitation. In other words, society repeatedly turned to the same individuals whenever a necessary job carried a social stigma. The executioner became a specialist in duties others preferred to avoid. It was dirty work, difficult work, and often emotionally isolating work. As the sun set and crowds dispersed from the town square, the executioner usually returned home alone. The king might praise justice. Officials might praise order. Spectators might discuss the day's events. Yet, few people wanted to share a meal with the man who carried out the sentence. It was one of history's loneliest professions, respected by authority, feared by the public, and remembered long after the worker himself was gone. And in our final chapter, we'll bring together all these forgotten occupations and discover what they reveal about the hidden people who kept medieval society functioning despite danger, disease, fear, and hardship. When we think about history, we usually remember kings, queens, generals, explorers, and famous inventors. Their names fill textbooks. Their portraits hang in museums. Their victories and failures are recorded in detail. But history was never built by famous people alone. Beneath every castle, every city wall, every cathedral, and every marketplace stood thousands of ordinary workers whose names disappeared. Long ago, the sin-eater, the gong farmer, the caretaker of the sick, the rat catcher, the bell ringer, and the executioner were rarely celebrated, yet society depended on them. Without their labor, many communities simply could not function. Perhaps the most shocking fact of all is that many of history's most important jobs were also the jobs nobody wanted. Someone had to remove waste. Someone had to care for the dying. Someone had to control infestations. Someone had to announce deaths. Someone had to perform society's most unpleasant duties. Most people preferred not to think about these tasks, but ignoring them never made them disappear. Civilization has always relied on individuals willing to do difficult, uncomfortable, and sometimes dangerous work while everyone else focused on daily life. What makes these professions fascinating is how familiar they still feel. The tools have changed, the technology has improved, and many of these jobs have vanished entirely, but the underlying reality remains the same. Even today, societies rely on people who perform challenging work behind the scenes. Sanitation workers keep cities clean, healthcare workers care for the sick, pest control specialists protect homes and businesses, emergency responders rush toward situations most people instinctively avoid. The faces change, the centuries change, But every generation depends on individuals willing to handle problems others would rather not confront. And yet, despite the hardship, many of these workers displayed remarkable resilience. The Gong farmer climbed down into dangerous pits night after night. The caretaker entered rooms filled with disease. The bell ringer carried difficult news through dark streets. The executioner accepted social isolation in exchange for performing his duty. None of these lives were glamorous. None promised fame. But they reveal something important about human societies. Survival often depends not on heroes in shining armor, but on ordinary people quietly doing unpleasant jobs that must be done. In a strange way, these forgotten professions offer a more intimate glimpse into history than many famous battles or royal ceremonies ever could. They show us what ordinary life actually felt like. They reveal the fears people carried, the problems communities faced, and the practical solutions they created. Behind every grand historical event were countless workers dealing with sickness, sanitation, death, hunger, fear, and uncertainty. History wasn't only written, it was also written in graveyards, hospitals, market alleys, bell towers, and dark underground pits. So tonight, as our journey through history's most unwanted jobs comes to an end, take a moment to remember the people whose names never appeared in chronicles or monuments, the workers who handled society's messes, dangers, and their stories may be strange, unsettling, and sometimes disturbing, but they remind us of a timeless truth. Every civilization rests upon countless unseen hands, and while history may have forgotten their names, their work shaped the world just as surely as any king or conqueror ever did. Thank you for spending this evening wherever you are in the world. I hope you have a peaceful night. The next journey through the wonderfully